October 25, 1944, 06:58 in the morning. The sea east of the island of Samar in the central Philippines is flat and grey under a low sky, with rain squalls drifting across it like smoke. A destroyer of the United States Navy is riding in a wide circle around 6 small aircraft carriers, doing the ordinary work of a screening ship. She is the United States ship Johnston, hull number DD-557, a Fletcher-class destroyer of about 2,100 tons standard displacement, armed with 5 guns of 5-inch .38 caliber and 10 torpedo tubes. Her commanding officer is Commander Ernest Evans, born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, of Cherokee and Creek descent, a man who had enlisted as an ordinary sailor before winning an appointment to the Naval Academy. 2.5 years earlier, he had served aboard a destroyer in the Java Sea and had watched an Allied fleet be taken apart by the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had told his crew at the ship's commissioning that this was going to be a fighting ship, that he intended to go in harm's way, and that anyone who did not want to go along had better get off right then. At 06:58, the horizon to the north fills with the pagoda masts of the most powerful surface force the Japanese Empire ever put to sea in a single formation: 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. Among them, the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, carrying 9 guns of 46-centimeter bore, each one capable of throwing a shell weighing more than 3,000 pounds to a range of 26 miles. Against her, Johnston carried a torpedo mount and a gun that could not penetrate her armor at any range whatsoever. Evans did not wait for an order. He turned his ship out of the screen and drove it directly at the enemy formation at flank speed, making smoke, alone, ahead of every other ship in the American force. He fired all 10 of his torpedoes at the leading heavy cruiser and blew the bow off her. Then the shells came. His ship was struck by heavy caliber fire that tore out an engine room, killed most of the men on the bridge, and took 2 fingers off his left hand. He kept fighting for another 3 hours from the afterpart of a ship that was steering by men hauling on the rudder by hand. Johnston went down at about 10:10 that morning. Of 327 men aboard, 186 died. Evans was seen alive in the water. He was never recovered. That much is a story of courage, and it has been told as a story of courage for 80 years. But it is not the interesting part. The interesting part is what the Japanese wrote down. In the action reports filed by that fleet, and in the interrogations conducted by American officers in Tokyo after the surrender, the force that Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita believed he had engaged that morning was a task group of fast fleet aircraft carriers, screened by cruisers, and possibly supported by battleships. He said so. His Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi, said so. His operations officer said so. Ship after ship in that formation logged the same thing, independently, with no chance to compare notes. None of it existed. There were no fleet carriers within 100 miles. There were no cruisers. There were no battleships. There were 6 escort carriers built on merchant hulls, capable of 19 knots, each mounting a single gun at the stern. There were 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The whole force displaced less than 1/10 of what was steaming toward it. At 9:11 that morning, with the American force broken open in front of him and the landing beaches of Leyte Gulf undefended beyond it, Kurita ordered his fleet to break off the action and turn north. He never came back. 6 ships had been sunk between them by the time the shooting stopped, 5 of them American. The Japanese had lost 3 heavy cruisers to an enemy that was armed for something else entirely, and the most powerful gun battery ever mounted on a warship had fired at an enemy surface force for the only time in its existence, at a target it outweighed beyond any comparison in naval history, and had come away with nothing. So the question is not how brave the men on those destroyers were. That has never been in dispute. The question is why the Imperial Japanese Navy, at the culminating moment of a war plan it had been building toward since before most of its officers were born, could not see what was in front of it. The answer is not that the Japanese were poor sailors. In the first year of the Pacific War they were, by a considerable margin, the finest surface fighting navy in the world, and they proved it repeatedly against the same American Navy, in the same ocean, with the same doctrine and the same weapons that failed them off Samar? The answer is not that they lost their nerve, and it is not that the Yamato was a flawed design or that Japanese gunnery was inaccurate, because neither claim survives contact with the evidence. The answer begins 2 decades earlier, in a set of institutional arguments conducted in wargame rooms in Newport, Rhode Island, and in shipyards on the Columbia River, over questions that in the 1920s and 1930s nobody in any navy considered decisive. It has to do with what a fleet knows, how quickly it knows it, and who is permitted to act on it. Start with the doctrine that failed, because it is the easiest thing in this story to underestimate. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not stumble into the battle off Samar. It arrived there at the end of a road it had been building for nearly 40 years. In May of 1905, in the Tsushima Strait, Admiral Togo Heihachiro had met the Russian Baltic Fleet after that fleet had steamed most of the way around the world and had destroyed it almost completely in a single afternoon. It remains one of the most decisive naval engagements ever fought. It also became, for the officer corps that inherited it, something closer to a theology than a lesson. The doctrine that grew out of it was called Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet battle. Its logic was clean and, given Japan's circumstances, defensible. Japan could not outbuild the United States. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had formalized that inferiority, fixing Japanese capital ship tonnage at 3/5 of the American figure. If a war came, Japan could not win it by attrition, because attrition is a contest of industrial capacity, and Japan would lose that contest. What Japan could do was arrange a single overwhelming engagement, fought at a place and time of Japanese choosing, in which the American battle line would be destroyed in a few hours, and the political will to continue would collapse with it. Everything followed from that premise. Because the decisive battle would be fought against a numerically superior enemy, the Japanese fleet would have to arrive at it, having already worn that enemy down. This produced the doctrine of attrition operations, in which submarines, land-based aircraft, and above all destroyer and cruiser squadrons would whittle the American fleet during its advance across the Pacific. Because those attacks would be made by lighter ships against heavier ones, they would have to be made at night, when optical range-finding favored the side that saw first, and when a torpedo could reach a battleship that a gun could not. And because they would be made at night, the Japanese Navy trained for night fighting with a realism no other navy in the world matched. That training was brutal, and it was serious. Japanese lookouts were selected for exceptional natural vision, and then trained for years on the great pedestal-mounted binoculars of 20-power magnification, with objective lenses of 12 and 18 centimeters, in exercises conducted without lights at high speed, in close formation. The cost of that realism is a matter of record. On the night of August 24, 1927, off the Jizosaki Light in the Mihonoseki Strait, a fleet exercise conducted in darkness and poor visibility went wrong. The light cruiser Jintsu rammed the destroyer Warabi and cut her in two, and in the confusion, the cruiser Naka collided with the destroyer Ashi. 119 men died in peacetime, in home waters, in training. The captain of the Jintsu took his own life before the inquiry could reach him. The Navy did not slow the program down. The capability was judged to be worth the price, and the men who came through that program went to war in 1941, convinced, with some justification, that darkness belonged to them. By the late 1930s, Japanese cruiser and destroyer squadrons could execute coordinated torpedo attacks in darkness at ranges where their opponents could not see them at all. They also built the weapon to match. The Type 93 torpedo, which American sailors later called the Long Lance, burned its fuel in pure oxygen rather than in compressed air. That single engineering decision, which several other navies had attempted and abandoned as too dangerous, gave it a range and a speed that were simply not in the same category as anything else afloat. It carried a warhead of roughly 1,000 pounds, it could run more than 20 miles at moderate speed, and because oxygen leaves almost no exhaust, it left virtually no wake to warn a target. American commanders in 1942, repeatedly concluded that they were under fire from submarines, because no surface ship was supposed to be able to reach them from that distance. And at the top of the structure sat the battleships. The Yamato and her sister Musashi were the physical expression of the entire doctrine. Displacing about 72,000 tons at full load, protected by a main belt of about 16 inches and turret faces of more than 2 feet, they were designed on a specific calculation. If Japan could not have as many battleships as the United States, then each Japanese battleship would have to be capable of defeating more than one American ship. The 46-centimeter gun was chosen because it exceeded anything that could pass through the Panama Canal, which meant it exceeded anything the United States Navy was expected to build. By any technical measure available in 1941, this was not a second-rate navy imitating Western models. In torpedo technology, in night optics, in surface tactical training, and in the raw specification of its heaviest units, the Imperial Japanese Navy led the world. If this kind of history is what you come here for, the parts that sit underneath the famous stories, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who care about getting it right. The proof that the doctrine worked is not theoretical. It is written across the first year of the Pacific War in Allied ships. On the night of February 27, 1942, in the Java Sea, a combined force of American, British, Dutch, and Australian cruisers and destroyers under the Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman engaged a Japanese covering force protecting the invasion convoy for Java. The battle lasted, on and off, for 7 hours. The Allied force was annihilated. 2 Dutch cruisers went down with almost all hands, including Doorman himself. The Allied ships had been assembled from 4 navies that shared no common signal book, no common doctrine, and in several cases, no common language, and they were engaging an enemy who had trained for precisely this fight for 2 decades. 6 months later came the sharper lesson. On the night of August 9, 1942, off Savo Island in the Solomons, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa took 7 cruisers and a destroyer down the slot toward the American landing area at Guadalcanal. The Allied screening force was disposed in 3 groups around the transport anchorage. Mikawa's ships found them in darkness, opened fire at close range with guns and torpedoes, and in a running action of roughly 32 minutes, sank 4 heavy cruisers. The Australian ship Canberra and the American ships Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria were all destroyed or left sinking. More than 1,000 Allied sailors died. Japanese damage amounted to moderate hits on 3 cruisers. It was the worst defeat in a surface engagement in the history of the United States Navy, and it was inflicted by a force that the Americans outnumbered. Then came Tassafaronga, on the night of November 30, 1942. Rear Admiral Carlton Wright took 5 American cruisers and 6 destroyers against 8 Japanese destroyers under Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who were attempting to deliver supply drums to Guadalcanal and who were not looking for a fight. The Americans had radar. They detected the Japanese first. They opened fire first. And in the exchange that followed, Tanaka's destroyers put torpedoes into 4 American heavy cruisers, sinking the Northampton and wrecking 3 others so thoroughly that they were out of the war for the better part of a year. The Japanese lost 1 destroyer. That engagement is the one worth holding on to because it demolishes the comfortable explanation. At Tassafaronga, the Americans had the technological advantage, the numerical advantage, and the element of surprise, and they were still beaten decisively. The Japanese system was not winning because it was lucky or because the Americans were caught asleep. It was winning because it was better. So the obvious question presents itself. If that system was that effective in 1942, what exactly happened to it by 1944? The first thing to understand is why the American Navy of 1942 lost those battles, because the reason is not incompetence, and it is not cowardice, and the truth of it is the hinge of this entire story. The United States Navy that fought at Savo Island and Tassafaronga was a professional force with a long tradition and a serious officer corps. Its ships were well built. Its crews were adequately trained by the standards of any peacetime navy. What it did not have was a way of turning what it detected into what it did. American cruisers in the Solomons carried radar. Some of them carried the new SG set, a microwave surface search radar that displayed contacts as bright marks on a circular screen, showing bearing and range at a glance, which was a genuine advance over anything any other navy had fielded. The problem was that the information appeared in one compartment, in the hands of one operator, and had to be relayed by voice to a commanding officer standing on a bridge in the dark, who was simultaneously trying to keep station on the ship ahead of him, interpret radio traffic, and identify targets by eye. There was no place on the ship where the radar picture, the radio picture, the sonar picture, and the lookout reports were assembled into a single coherent representation of the tactical situation. The consequence was that American ships repeatedly detected Japanese formations and then failed to act on the detection in time. At Savo Island, radar contacts were reported, considered, and discounted. Formations were rigidly organized around the assumption that the senior officer present would evaluate the situation and issue orders, which meant that when the senior officer's ship was hit early, as happened repeatedly, the formation stopped functioning. Captains waited for instructions that were never going to come. There was also the matter of the torpedoes. The American Mark 14 submarine torpedo and the Mark 15 destroyer torpedo shared a magnetic influence exploder and a contact pistol, and through 1942 and much of 1943, both mechanisms failed at rates that would have been considered a scandal in peacetime. Torpedoes ran deeper than set. Warheads failed to detonate on contact. The Bureau of Ordnance spent the better part of 2 years insisting that the fault lay with the crews. The problems were not fully corrected until the second half of 1943. So Munsheim. But underneath the equipment failures lay something both navies shared. The American and Japanese fleets of 1942 agreed almost completely on what a surface battle was. It was a contest in which two formations closed to a range at which they could see each other, at which point the side that shot better and maneuvered better would win. The Japanese had simply optimized for that contest more thoroughly, and specifically for the version of it fought in darkness. That shared premise is the thing that would eventually break, and neither side broke it deliberately. A veteran of the Solomons campaign, describing what those nights were actually like, said that the first indication of the enemy was usually the flash of his guns, and that by then it was already too late. It is a small remark, and it contains the whole tactical problem. The engagement began at the moment of mutual visual contact. Whoever had prepared for that moment more thoroughly took the first salvo. The first salvo, at those ranges, frequently decided everything else. Savo Island deserves a closer look than it usually receives, and not for the reason it is normally cited. Mikawa's approach was a masterpiece of the doctrine. He came down through the Solomons at high speed with his ships in a single column, catapulted float planes ahead to drop parachute flares over the Allied screening ships, and used those flares to silhouette the Allied cruisers against the light, while his own ships remained invisible against the dark bulk of Savo Island. His torpedoes were in the water before most of the Allied ships knew there was an enemy present. His gunnery was accurate at ranges under 5,000 yards. In half an hour he inflicted a defeat that the United States Navy studied for the next 20 years, and then he turned around and went home. Behind the screen he had just destroyed lay the entire American transport fleet supporting the Guadalcanal landing, unloading in the dark, essentially undefended. Mikawa did not attack it. He reformed his scattered ships and withdrew up the slot, because he calculated that he could not finish the transports and clear the area before American carrier aircraft found him at dawn. He was, by the terms of his own doctrine, correct. The doctrine existed to destroy warships. The transports were not the objective. He was heavily criticized for it afterward, in Japan and in every account written since. But the criticism usually misses what the decision reveals, which is that the Japanese Navy had built an instrument for destroying an enemy battle line and had never seriously thought through what to do with a battle that did not fit that shape. Mikawa won the engagement he had trained for, and then withdrew from a situation his training did not describe. Hold that in mind, because 26 months later, off Sama, another Japanese admiral would break off in front of another undefended American invasion force, and the two decisions are connected by more than coincidence. What neither navy understood in the autumn of 1942 was that the American answer to Japanese night-fighting superiority would not be better night fighting. The Americans would not train harder at optics, or build a better torpedo than the Type 93, or match the Japanese in the discipline of the high-speed column. They would instead build something that made the contest itself obsolete, and they would do it out of institutional habits formed long before the war began, for reasons that had nothing to do with Japan. To find where those habits came from, you have to go back to the 1920s, to a two-story brick building on Coasters Harbor Island in Narragansett Bay. The Naval War College at Newport, Rhode Island, was in that period a small institution with a modest budget and limited prestige within a navy that was itself constrained by treaty and by the political mood of a country with no appetite for military spending. What it had was a linoleum floor marked out as an ocean and a body of officers who spent their careers refighting a hypothetical Pacific War against Japan, designated in the color-coded war plans as Orange. Between the wars, the college played that campaign, in one form or another, over and over again, in a program of gaming that ran without interruption for 2 decades. Officers moved model ships across the floor, under rules that attempted to model gunnery, torpedo performance, air search, endurance, and above all the movement of information. Every future flag officer of consequence passed through it. Chester Nimitz was there in 1922 and 1923. Raymond Spruance served on the staff. Ernest King, Frank Jack Fletcher, Mark Mitcher, and Halsey all worked through the same problems on the same floor. Nimitz later said that the war in the Pacific had been reenacted in the game rooms at Newport by so many people and in so many different ways that nothing that happened during the war was a surprise to him, with the single exception of the kamikaze attacks at the end of it. That remark is usually quoted as a tribute to American foresight. It is more interesting than that. What the games actually taught was not a set of correct answers. Several of the specific conclusions drawn at Newport were wrong. What the games taught, repeatedly and expensively in reputational terms, was that in a Pacific campaign, the commander would almost never possess an accurate picture of the situation, that the picture he did possess would be delayed, incomplete, and frequently false, and that any plan requiring precise coordination between widely separated forces would fail. The Japanese Naval Staff College conducted its own war games and reached broadly similar conclusions about the difficulty of Pacific coordination. This is the crucial point, and it is the point that most accounts of this war miss entirely. Both navies observed the same problem. They responded to it in opposite ways. The Japanese response was to plan more thoroughly. If the fog of war made improvisation unreliable, then the answer was to reduce the need for improvisation by specifying in advance, in enormous detail, what each element of the fleet would do at each stage of an operation. Japanese operational plans of the war years are extraordinary documents, precise to the hour, allocating forces to phases that would unfold in sequence. The plan for the Leyte operation, Shogo-ichi, ran to a level of detail that assumed 4 separate forces converging from different directions on a schedule, under radio silence, with almost no capacity to adjust. The American response was the opposite. If the picture would always be incomplete, then the answer was to build a fleet that could function without waiting for a complete picture. That meant pushing decision authority down to the officers who could actually see something, and it meant accepting that subordinate commanders would sometimes make decisions their superiors would not have made. 2 very different navies came out of one shared observation. Only one of them produced a lieutenant commander in a destroyer escort who would turn toward a battleship fleet without being told to. The first mechanism was information, and the argument about it inside the United States Navy was neither quick nor friendly. Radar arrived in the fleet in 1940 and 1941 and was regarded by a substantial part of the officer corps as an interesting supplement to lookouts. Gunnery officers who had spent their careers mastering optical range-finding did not accept easily that an electronic device should be trusted over a trained eye, and in the early sets, The skepticism was not unreasonable, because early radar was unreliable, difficult to interpret, and prone to returns that meant nothing. What changed the situation was not the equipment, it was an argument about where the information should go. Out of the confused night actions around Guadalcanal came a proposition that seems obvious now, and was not obvious then. If a ship was receiving information from radar, from radio, from sonar, and from lookouts, and if no single human being on the bridge could integrate all of it while also fighting the ship, then the integration should be done somewhere else, by people whose only job was to do it, and the result should be handed to the captain as a finished picture rather than as raw reports. The compartment where this was done became the Combat Information Center. By 1943, it was standard across the fleet, from carriers down to destroyer escorts. It held plotting boards, radar repeaters, radio receivers, and a team of officers and enlisted men whose entire function was to maintain a continuously updated representation of everything within detection range, friendly and hostile, and to feed it upward and outward. The second half of that sentence matters more than the first. The picture did not merely go to the captain, it went out over voice radio to every other ship in the formation, on the short-range circuit known as talk between ships. American task groups by 1944 were running a continuous shared narration of the tactical situation, in plain English, in which any ship that saw something told everyone else immediately. Japanese practice ran the other way. Radio silence was doctrinal, transmissions were formal and encrypted, and the tactical picture was assembled at the flagship and distributed downward as orders. Japan did develop radar, and by 1944, sets were installed on major units, but it arrived late, the sets were less capable, the operators were less experienced, and, most importantly, there was no institutional structure comparable to a combat information center to convert what the set detected into something the fleet could act on. Now return to that morning off Samar and look at it from the Japanese side. Kurita's force emerged from San Bernardino Strait before dawn and was still shifting from its night search disposition into a daytime anti-aircraft formation when masts appeared to the southeast. He ordered a general attack, which in practice meant that his divisions pursued independently rather than forming a battle line. His ships were spread over a wide area, moving at different speeds, in intermittent rain, into smoke that American destroyers began laying within minutes. He had no shared tactical picture. He had reports from individual ships, arriving by signal lamp and by encrypted radio, describing what each of them believed it could see through smoke at long range. Those reports said fleet carriers. They said cruisers. And once the reports said that, there was no mechanism anywhere in that formation capable of correcting them. The Americans, meanwhile, were doing something Kurita's officers would not have recognized as a fleet action at all. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding the escort carrier unit, made a handful of decisions in the first few minutes and then very largely stopped commanding. He did not attempt to control the battle. He set a direction and let 7 captains fight their own ships. That is a description no Japanese officer would have written of his own force, and it is the reason the American ships behaved as they did. Every one of those 7 captains attacked. Some of them attacked before any order arrived. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, taking a convoy escort into a gunnery duel with heavy cruisers, recorded in his action report that he had told his crew they faced a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected, and that they would do what damage they could. That is the mechanism that produced the false reports on the Japanese side. It was not deception. Nobody planned it. American ships behaved the way a heavy screening force protecting fleet carriers would behave, because their doctrine told each captain to act, and the Japanese, reading that behavior through smoke with no way to verify it, wrote down what the behavior implied. It is worth walking through what those 2.5 hours actually consisted of, because the sequence explains the confusion better than any summary of it can. The first American to see the Japanese fleet was a pilot flying an anti-submarine patrol, who reported a surface force of battleships and cruisers closing from the north. The reaction aboard the flagship was disbelief. There were no Japanese heavy units within reach, according to every report Sprague had. He asked the pilot to check the identification. The pilot replied that he could see pagoda masts and that the ships were shooting at him. At about 06:59, the Yamato opened fire at a range of roughly 34,000 yards. The first shell splashes that landed among the escort carriers were colored, because Japanese battleships used dyed bursting charges so that each ship could distinguish its own fall of shot from its neighbors. Sailors on the American flight decks watched pink and green and yellow water columns rise around them and understood, before anyone told them, what class of gun was firing. Sprague did 3 things in the next 4 minutes. He turned the carriers east into the wind to launch aircraft, accepting that this took him briefly toward the enemy. He ordered every ship to make smoke, and he broadcast a contact report in plain, uncoded English, which was a deliberate violation of communications security made on the judgment that being understood immediately mattered more than being unreadable to the enemy. The smoke mattered more than almost anything else that morning. Destroyers laid black funnel smoke by cutting the air supply to their boilers and white chemical fog from generators aft, and the wind held it low across the water. Japanese gunnery officers, working optically with excellent rangefinders and no usable radar solution, lost the ability to hold a target for more than a few salvos at a time. Ships would emerge from the smoke, be straddled, and disappear again. Then, at about 7:06, a rain squall drifted across the American formation, and Sprague steered into it and stayed in it for a quarter of an hour. When the carriers came out of the squall, the range had closed, and the order went out for a torpedo attack. Johnston was already going in. Howell and Herman followed. The attack that developed was not coordinated in any formal sense, because there was no time to organize one, and the 3 destroyers went in at intervals against different targets. Howell fired half her torpedoes at the battleship Congo and the rest at a heavy cruiser, and was then caught between the cruiser column and the battleships and shot to pieces from both sides over the better part of an hour. She lost an engine, then her steering, then most of her guns, and finally went dead in the water and was pounded until she rolled over at about 08:55. Of roughly 325 men aboard, fewer than 90 survived. Herman's mourning was closer to farce than to tragedy, at least at the start. She very nearly collided with the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts in the smoke, then nearly ran into Howell, then very nearly into Johnston, then emerged from the murk directly in front of a Japanese battleship column and fired torpedoes at the Haruna, before turning to engage heavy cruisers with her guns. At one point, she was exchanging fire with the Yamato at a range at which her shells could accomplish nothing at all, and the Yamato was forced to turn away to the north to comb a spread of torpedoes fired by the American destroyers, a spread that recent reconstruction credits principally to Howell, which carried Kurita and his staff bodily out of the center of the battle for a period of minutes at exactly the moment his tactical picture was forming. Then Sprague ordered the destroyer escorts in. These were ships of about 1,300 tons, built to shepherd merchant convoys and hunt submarines, and nobody had ever intended them to attack cruisers. The order that went out over voice radio, remembered afterward by men on several ships, was for the small boys to interpose. The Samuel B. Roberts, the Dennis, the John C. Butler, and the Raymond went in. Copeland's engineer had already bypassed the safety limits on the turbines to get the Samuel B. Roberts up beyond her designed speed. She fired her 3 torpedoes at a heavy cruiser and then spent nearly an hour at close range firing her 2 guns at targets that could not be meaningfully harmed by them, firing until she was very nearly out of ammunition. She was eventually hit by heavy caliber fire that opened her side, and she sank at about 10:05. Meanwhile, the carriers were running. They could make about 19 knots at best, and the ships pursuing them could make well over 25, which meant that the gap was closing continuously for 2 hours, and there was nothing anyone aboard could do about it, except turn away and keep launching aircraft. The single 5-inch gun on the stern of each escort carrier was fired throughout, and although those guns could not decide anything, more than one of them registered hits on Japanese cruisers. Gunners on the White Plains cheered when they saw a cruiser turn away, and had no idea whether they had caused it. Gambier Bay was the one that could not keep up. She took her first serious hit at about 0810, lost speed as water entered her engineering spaces, and once she fell behind the formation, she was finished. Japanese cruisers closed to within a few thousand yards and fired into her at a range that made missing impossible. She was abandoned at about 0850 and capsized at about 0907. Accounts of her dead differ, and the figure lies somewhere between about 130 and 150. She remains the only American aircraft carrier of the war, destroyed by enemy gunfire. 4 minutes later, Kurita ordered the withdrawal. The Americans did not understand what had happened. Ships were still fighting, aircraft were still attacking, men were still in the water, and the Japanese formation simply turned and went away northward. A signalman aboard Sprague's flagship shouted that they were getting away, which is the only recorded reaction that captures the moment properly. An hour and a half later, while the survivors were still being pulled out of the sea, a Japanese aircraft dived deliberately into the flight deck of the escort carrier St. Lo, detonated the ordnance in her hangar, and sank her in about half an hour. It was among the first successful attacks of the organized suicide campaign. 113 of her men were killed or listed as missing, and about 30 more died later of their wounds, on a ship that had already survived the impossible part of the morning. The second mechanism was industrial, and it is the one that the technical histories tend to skip, because there is nothing elegant about it. Henry Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. He was a construction contractor from the American West, who had built roads, and had been part of the consortia that built the Hoover and Grand Coulee dams. He came to shipbuilding in 1940 with no naval background whatsoever and a set of assumptions imported from civil engineering, chief among them that a ship was an assembly of prefabricated sections that could be welded together by semi-skilled labor rather than a hand-crafted object built up plate by riveters who had served long apprenticeships. The professional shipbuilding industry, and a considerable part of the Navy's technical bureau, regarded this as the opinion of an amateur. Welded hulls were suspected of brittleness. Prefabrication was thought to compromise structural integrity. The objections were not frivolous, and some early welded ships did suffer serious hull fractures in cold water, a problem eventually traced to steel chemistry and weld design rather than to the method itself. Kaiser built them anyway. At the yard he established at Vancouver, Washington, on the Columbia River, his organization produced 50 escort carriers of the Casablanca class, which remains the largest number of aircraft carriers of a single class ever built by anyone. Toward the end of the run, ships were being delivered in a matter of months from keel laying, at a pace no traditional yard had believed possible. These were not good warships, and nobody pretended otherwise. A Casablanca-class escort carrier displaced roughly 8,000 tons standard, made about 19 knots on a good day, carried no armor of consequence, and mounted a single 5-inch gun at the stern. Their crews called them jeep carriers, and offered an alternative reading of the classification letters as combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. They were built on a mercantile design philosophy for a wartime purpose, and they were regarded within the fleet as a compromise. But the arithmetic is what matters. The Imperial Japanese Navy commissioned about 19 aircraft carriers of all types during the entire war, including conversions. American yards produced more than 150. The destroyer escorts came off the ways in comparable numbers, more than 500 of them, built to a specification that deliberately traded speed and armament for the ability to be produced in quantity. That is why Taffy 3 existed in the first place. 6 carriers and 7 small escorts could be positioned off a landing beach to fly ground support and anti-submarine patrols, because the United States by 1944 had enough of them that they were no longer scarce. And it is why the aircraft that fought that morning were armed as they were. Those air groups were loaded for supporting infantry ashore and hunting submarines. They carried general purpose and fragmentation bombs, depth charges, and machine gun ammunition. Almost none of them were carrying armor-piercing bombs or torpedoes, because nobody had planned for them to attack a battleship fleet. They attacked anyway, continuously, from the first minutes, in a manner that no doctrine anywhere described. Avengers on anti-submarine patrol dropped depth charges on heavy cruisers because that was what was in the bay. Wildcats strafed battleship bridges with 50 caliber machine gun fire that could not penetrate anything but which forced ships to maneuver and made spotting difficult. Pilots who had exhausted their ammunition made dummy attack runs at Japanese cruisers to draw them off course, then landed on whatever deck would take them, on the carriers of the neighboring task unit to the south, rearmed with whatever was available, and went back. Rear Admiral Felix Stump's group, farther from the action, had time to arm its Avengers properly with torpedoes and heavier bombs, and those strikes did much of the serious damage. 3 Japanese heavy cruisers were lost in that engagement. The Chokai, the Chikuma, and the Suzuya all went down, and the Kumano, her bow blown off by Johnston's torpedo, was never restored to full service. Fitted with a false bow and limited to about 15 knots, she was torpedoed again in November and finally sunk on November 25, 1944, by aircraft from the carrier Ticonderoga while lying under repair on the Luzon coast. Historians still argue over the precise share of credit for each. The Chokai's wreck, located in 2019, produced evidence that has caused a serious reappraisal of the older account of her loss, and recent scholarship attributes more of the damage to air attack and less to certain widely repeated explanations than was previously assumed. What is not in dispute is that they were sunk by a combination of surface torpedoes and aircraft that were, in a substantial number of cases, carrying the wrong ordnance for the job. If this is holding your attention, a like helps more than you would think, and subscribing means the next one of these finds you. The third element is the one that could not be corrected once the battle had started, and it is a matter of physics and metallurgy rather than command. The Japanese Navy had spent decades perfecting the armor-piercing shell because the decisive battle doctrine assumed that the target would be an armored capital ship. The Type 91 projectile was an outstanding piece of ordnance design. It carried a delay fuse in the base, so that the shell would penetrate armor plate and detonate inside the target rather than on the surface. It carried a specially shaped cap intended to let it continue running underwater when it fell short, so that it would strike the hull below the armor belt. That was the diving shell. In practice, the underwater effect almost never worked, and there is only one confirmed instance in the whole war of a Japanese shell doing what it was designed to do down there. Against armor plate struck directly, however, the projectile was superb. Against an unarmored ship, it was close to useless. A base fuse with a delay requires resistance in order to function. The shell must strike something hard enough to initiate the sequence. The hull plating of an escort carrier or of a destroyer escort built to mercantile scantlings offered almost none. Japanese shells of 8-inch, 14-inch and 46-centimeter caliber repeatedly passed straight through American ships that morning, entering one side and leaving the other without detonating, punching clean holes through compartments and out into the sea beyond. The escort carrier Kalinin Bay took 15 direct hits, most of them 8-inch, and survived. One shell holed her below the waterline, passed all the way through the ship, and burst only after it had come out the other side. Ships took heavy caliber hits that would have destroyed a cruiser and remained underway. It did not save all of them. High explosive and anti-aircraft rounds did lethal damage. Fragments killed men throughout the formation, and against a ship hit often enough, the distinction stopped mattering, as the Gambier Bay had already demonstrated. But the general effect was that a fleet built to destroy armored ships found itself firing its best ammunition into targets that the ammunition was not designed to defeat, and there was no way to change it. You cannot re-engineer a shell in the middle of an engagement. The Japanese guns were accurate. Their fire control, worked out optically with excellent rangefinders, was competent even in poor visibility, and the shells went through. Layer these together, and the picture from the Japanese bridge becomes coherent for the first time. Kurita was working from a tactical picture assembled out of individual visual reports through smoke and rain, with no central integration and no radar of comparable capability, which told him he was fighting fleet carriers. He was under continuous air attack from aircraft that never stopped coming and whose numbers he had no way to count, which was consistent with fleet carriers. His ships were being torpedoed by destroyers, behaving with an aggression that in his own navy would have indicated a heavy screening force protecting something valuable. His formation had never assembled into a battle line, and he had lost tactical control of it within the first hour, partly because his own flagship had been forced to turn north to comb a torpedo spread, and had been carried physically away from the action for a period, and his shells were hitting and, from a distance, not visibly destroying. Add to that what had already happened to him. On October 23, his flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago, had been torpedoed and sunk beneath him by an American submarine in the Palawan Passage, and he had been in the water before being pulled out. A second heavy cruiser was sunk in the same attack, and a third badly damaged. On October 24, his force had been attacked from the air all day in the Sibuyan Sea, and the Musashi, sister to his new flagship, had gone down under a weight of bombs and torpedoes that the traditional count puts at 17 and 19 respectively, though American analysts working from survivor testimony afterward thought the true number of torpedo hits was considerably lower. He had transferred his flag to Yamato without his experienced staff and without the communications organization he was accustomed to. He had not slept properly in 2 days. He also did not know the single most important fact about the battle he was fighting. He did not know that Admiral William Halsey had taken the entire Third Fleet north, carriers and fast battleships together, chasing a Japanese carrier force under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa that had been sent out as a deliberate decoy with almost no aircraft aboard. Kurita had no way to know the decoy had worked. As far as he understood his own situation, the American fast carrier force was still somewhere to the east and might be anywhere. And then, at the decisive moment, he received a report of an American task force to the northeast. It was wrong. There was no such force, but it was consistent with everything he already believed, and at 9/11 he broke off the action and turned north to find it. The American command failure that put him in that position deserves stating plainly, because it was as institutional as anything on the Japanese side. The United States had 2 fleets in the Philippines, answering to 2 different superiors. Halsey's Third Fleet reported to Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet reported to General Douglas MacArthur. No single officer between them owned San Bernardino Strait. Halsey had signaled a contingency plan to form his fast battleships into a separate task force to guard the strait. Kinkaid and Nimitz both read that signal as a statement of accomplished fact, and when Halsey went north, he took everything with him and told nobody clearly that the strait was open. The message Nimitz eventually sent asking where those battleships were is famous for the wrong reason. Naval enciphering practice required nonsense padding at the beginning and end of a transmission, separated from the text by double letters. The padding at the end of that message read that the world wonders. The clerks aboard Halsey's flagship stripped the opening padding correctly and failed to strip the closing phrase, so what reached the Admiral read as a public rebuke rather than a question. Halsey wrote later that he felt as though he had been struck in the face and threw his cap on the deck. He continued north for roughly another hour before turning south, by which time it no longer mattered. The interrogations conducted in Tokyo after the surrender are the closest thing this story has to a controlled experiment. American officers questioned Kurita, his chief of staff Koyanagi, and his operations officer separately, along with officers from other ships, over a period of weeks in 1945. What is striking about the transcripts is not what any individual said. It is the consistency across men who had been on different ships, who in several cases had had no opportunity to compare accounts, and who had every incentive to construct a flattering explanation and largely did not bother. They believed they were engaging fleet carriers. They believed the screen included cruisers. They were unable to determine the composition or the size of the force in front of them at any point in the action. Kurita told his interrogators that his information was very unsatisfactory and argued that inside the confined waters of Leyte Gulf, he would not be able to use the maneuvering advantage of his ships, whereas in open water, he could be of more use. Koyanagi described the decision to turn north as one taken in near unanimity by the staff. Kurita's own decision rather than an order from above, and framed it as a move to seek a larger engagement rather than as a retreat. Read one at a time. Each statement sounds like a man justifying himself. Read together, they describe a formation in which nobody, at any level, at any point in 2.5 hours, could establish what was in front of them. That is not a failure of individual perception. It is the signature of a fleet with no mechanism for turning perception into knowledge. So here is the verdict, and it is not the one the popular version of this battle offers. Takeo Kurita did not lose his nerve. His gunners did not miss. The Yamato was not a white elephant. And the men of Taffy 3, whose courage that morning is not exaggerated by any telling of it, did not defeat a battleship fleet by heroism alone, because heroism does not stop a 46-centimeter shell. What failed off Sama was the theory of naval warfare that the Imperial Japanese Navy had been perfecting since 1905. That theory held that sea power is decided by the destruction of the enemy's fleet in a concentrated engagement, that the engagement is won by the side that shoots better at the moment of contact, and that the way to prepare for it is to specify in advance, in detail, what every ship will do. Every element of that theory was reasonable. Several of its elements were demonstrably correct, and the Allied cruisers on the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound are the proof. The American Navy did not beat that theory by becoming better at it. It stopped competing on those terms. It built a fleet in which knowledge was assembled continuously rather than at the moment of contact, distributed sideways rather than downward, and acted on by whoever happened to be in a position to act. It built ships in numbers that made individual ships expendable, which meant that a force could be stationed off a beach whose loss would not be strategically fatal. And it produced captains who were expected to attack without being told to, because the alternative, waiting for an order from an admiral who could not see what they could see, had already been tried at Savo Island and had cost 4 cruisers in half an hour. Neither navy chose these things as a response to the other. The Newport war games were not designed to defeat Kantai Kessen. The Combat Information Center came out of a specific tactical embarrassment in the Solomons. Kaiser's yards were built to solve a merchant shipping crisis in the Atlantic. 3 separate developments, none of them aimed at the problem they eventually solved, arrived in the same patch of ocean on the same morning. Underneath all of it sat a difference in what each navy believed a subordinate officer was for. The Japanese system treated the officer as the executor of a plan formed above him, and it produced, at its best, a discipline and a precision that no other navy matched. The American system treated him as a source of judgment and accepted the errors that came with that. Both approaches produced excellent sailors. Only one of them produced a fleet that could function when the plan stopped describing reality. The men who fought that morning received what the record thought they were owed. Ernest Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, the first Native American sailor in the United States Navy to receive it. Robert Copeland of the Samuel B. Roberts and Leon Kintberger of the Hole each received the Navy Cross, as did Clifton Sprague. Gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, found mortally wounded still attempting to load a shell by hand into a wrecked gun aboard the Samuel B. Roberts, received the Silver Star, and a frigate was later named for him. The whole of Taffy 3 received the Presidential Unit Citation. The cost was 1,161 American sailors and airmen killed or missing, and 913 wounded, and 5 ships, because in addition to the 4 lost to gunfire, the escort carrier St. Lo was struck later that morning by one of the first organized suicide aircraft attacks of the war and sank within half an hour. Kurita's later life reads as a long refusal. He was relieved of Sea Command in December of 1944 and made commandant of the Naval Academy at Etajima, where by the accounts of his students, he prepared them for the rebuilding of a defeated country rather than for a death in its defense. After the war, he worked quietly and lived modestly. When American interrogators asked him directly what had caused the defeat, he told them the fleet had run out of oil. In 1954, he told the journalist Masanori Ito that turning away had been a mistake, and afterward withdrew the statement and largely stopped discussing it. Only in the last days of his life, privately, to a former student from Etajima, did he say that he had turned north because he did not believe in spending the lives of his men in a war he had long since concluded was lost. He died on December 19, 1977, at the age of 88, having never given a public account. The Yamato had less time. In April of 1945, she was sent toward Okinawa without air cover, on an operation her own planners understood to be a one-way passage, and was sunk by American carrier aircraft on April 7, 1945, with the loss of most of her crew. The largest battleship ever built fired her main battery at an enemy surface force exactly once, off Samar, for a few hours, at a target chosen for her by accident. There is a final irony in the doctrine itself. Kantai Kessen was not stupid. It was a coherent answer to a real strategic problem, and it was built by serious professionals who had studied the previous war more honestly than most. The Type 93 torpedo remained the finest weapon of its kind in the world, until the day the war ended. Japanese night surface tactics were studied closely by the United States Navy afterward, and elements of them influenced post-war thinking. The doctrine was a brilliant solution to a naval war that was decided by fleets meeting each other, and the United States Navy in 1944 had simply stopped fighting that war. The wrecks stayed where they fell for most of a century, in water too deep for anyone to reach. On March 31, 2021, a crewed submersible operated by Victor Vescovo's expedition team, with the naval historian Park Stevenson aboard, descended more than 6,400 meters into the Philippine Trench and found the shattered bow section of a Fletcher-class destroyer sitting upright on the sea floor, with the hull number 557 still legible on the plating. It was, at the time, the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed by human beings. The survey work suggested that some of the heavy shells that killed the ship may have come from the Yamato herself, rather than from the battleship her crew believed had hit them, which is a small correction, and a strange one, and it will probably be argued about for years. In June of 2022, the same team found the Samuel B. Roberts nearly 1,000 meters deeper still, which made her, in turn, the deepest wreck ever located. Both ships are broken, both are intact enough to be recognized, and both are lying in water so deep that no salvage will ever reach them. What they mark is the boundary between two ideas about what a navy is. One idea held that a fleet is an instrument of concentrated destruction, to be perfected, husbanded, and spent in a single decisive act. The other held that a fleet is a distributed system for producing knowledge and acting on it faster than the enemy, in which individual units are replaceable and individual judgment is not. The first idea produced the Yamato. The second produced the ships that were still there when she turned away.